Dialogue and Critical Race Theory, a conversation on communicating better over racial issues. Part of the series, Communication Skills with Daniel Rainey. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by instantmediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis. I'm a lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And I am Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate and mediator from Warsaw, Poland.
And I'm Daniel Rainey, Holistic Solutions Incorporated.
All right. So welcome back, everyone. We are on another episode of the Instant Mediations podcast called Lawyers and Mediators International. And so today's topic is called Dialogue and Critical Race Theory, a conversation on communicating better over quote unquote racial issues. And a reason that we decided to talk about this today is because we are on the eve of Martin Luther King Day, which is coming up on January 17th of 2022. And we thought it was going to be a trending topic to discuss conversations when it comes to critical race theory. Because one of the things that we've discovered is a lot of people in our society have a really hard time talking about certain subjects. So critical race theory is just one of them. We could, of course, talk about lots of other controversial or topics that are offensive to some folks or that might be taken one way by others. But we wanted to focus on this one dealing with race. And the person we have to speak to about it today is Daniel Rainey of Holistic Solutions Incorporated. And Daniel's been on the podcast, many, many times before as a communications expert. And so we always go back to him for, thoughts and tips on how to communicate well. Okay, so Daniel, wanted to just open the floor to you to delve into the problem that exists when it comes to dialoguing over this topic of critical race theory and moving us forward on some other things that we can discuss over it.
Sure. Well, currently we don't have a dialogue about critical race theory or about race generally. What we have are confrontational meetings. And all you have to do is look in the newspaper to see reports of school board meetings and other venues where people on both sides are coming and talking at one another, but not necessarily talking to one another. And one of the things that I would suggest is that part of our disagreement about the notion of critical race theory particularly is that most of the people who are talking about it probably actually don't know what it means, critical race theory, don't know what it is. And I don't say that as a way to put down anybody's intelligence or their point of view. It's just that it is an academic movement. It has roots in the academy. And it's been used, or some of the elements of it have been used by both sides in the public debate as they go forward and talk about critical race theory, especially in the schools. So if you're looking for sort of background on critical race theory, it actually starts as an outgrowth of what's called critical theory, which goes back to my graduate student days in the Frankfurt School with Herbert Marcuse and Gregory Lukács and Jürgen Habermas in Frankfurt. And basically, there are a couple of things that are tenets of that theoretical approach. And that is the basic one that is really with us now in this debate is that social problems generally stem from social structures. Now, that's a fairly general statement, but it's a very powerful statement also. critical race theory, which comes out of that sort of mindset, basically starting with Derek Bell and a few others back in the 1970s, basically says two things about race. One is that race is a social construct. And the second is that racism is a product not just of individual points of view, but it's a product of social structures and definitions. And what's meant by racism is a social construct is, Mac, you're dark skinned, I'm light skinned. 200 years ago, you would have been considered non-human. I would have been able to own you. I would assume that your intelligence level was such that it would not measure up to human standards, and I would treat you accordingly. Because you were not human, I could own you, and I'd be a good Christian and still own you because you're not human. That's a social construct. Today, you're a lawyer. You operate in a society that acknowledges your humanity. You may not be in a position to reap all the benefits of being white in this culture, because I do believe white privilege does exist, but you're viewed as a human being, and you're viewed as someone who has the rights of any citizen under the Constitution. That's a social construct. You're exactly the same person you would have been 200 years ago and now, but the way you're looked at, the way you're treated, and who you're seen by, what you're seen as, and whom you're seen by, are a social construct. We've decided that you're human, and so society treats you as though you're human. And so we have the power as societies to define reality to a certain extent, and we react on those definitions of reality. On the other hand, racism, if you look at racism, is an individual response. I may look at you as a Black person, and I may be on the far fringe that says, well, maybe you really aren't quite human, and I may really not like you because of that. Or I may be on the other far fringe that says, no, we're all one big family of man. Both of those are social constructs, but they're individualized from social constructs that are around us. Now, that's probably a long and involved way of introducing the notion that the way we talk about this now in public is not based on the reality of what the theory is. It's based on the perceptions that people have of what's happening as a result of the discussion around race, right? So if I wanted to improve that conversation, the first place I have to start is to say, what is it actually that we are talking about? Does that make sense to you?
Yes. And Natalia, do you want to jump in?
Yes, because I do understand that talking about those things require presenting a special environment for that. So to a degree, that requires some sort of an effort from any party taking part in this conversation. Dan, when you were to organize a meeting that would discuss critical race theory, or when you were to speak to people who have expressed, let us say, offensive statements, if not say racist statements, how would you do that? How would you approach people, make them sit at one table and listen to each other to understand?
Well, to start with, I wouldn't try to make them do it. I'll just sort of back up a little bit. If you look at the notion of communication, the way communication occurs, one of the most powerful elements in communication, in understanding through communication, in my view, are the perceptual filters that we carry around with us. Each speaker has a set of perceptual filters that will suggest to them what they should say, how they should say it, and to whom they should say it. And each listener has a set of perceptual filters that will help them understand what they're hearing, what they think about what they're hearing, how they define the things that come to them, and how they should react to that. And so one of the things that happens in difficult conversations, and especially, for example, in discussions about racism, that if I'm white, I have a set of perceptual filters that tell me who I am, what I ought to say, who I should say it to, how I should say it, etc. And if you're Black, you have the same kinds of perceptual filters that filter what's coming to you. So one of the things that you have to do if you're going to be a third party in the middle of people who are talking about very difficult issues is figure out a way to minimize the impact of those cultural filters that are automatically there because you're a human being. Everybody has them. So I wouldn't try to make people sit down. There's a concept, and Mac and I have talked about this a little bit, called transactional distance. And I'm going to do a little bit of damage to Michael Moore's theory. It starts out with transactional theory comes out of education and talks about the distance there. I've used this phrase, and I've used the concept in dispute resolution to talk about psychological and social distance and communicative distance between people. And basically the theory is that the more distant I am from you, psychologically, socially, and communicatively, the less chance there is for dialogue. And if I can move us closer together, in ways that close that distance, if I can make it not quite so much an us and them, then I have a chance to have dialogue. So the closer I can get you, the more likely it is to have dialogue. And so if I were going to start a conversation about critical race theory among people who are talking about it today, I wouldn't try to force them into the conversation. The first thing would need to be a desire on the part of the people who would come to the table to be there. Because if you didn't have a desire to be there, if you were coming just because you were forced to be there, then it's very unlikely that you're going to question the filters that you're using. It's very unlikely that you're going to actually hear what the other party has to say. And so we're going to repeat the same kind of things that we're hearing, so that the people who are against critical race theory say that it's tearing down the nation, that it's teaching Black kids to hate white kids, it's teaching white kids to be ashamed of their heritage. And on the other side, people who say that opposing critical race theory is nothing more than a modern version of white supremacy, in the same vein as the Ku Klux Klan. And so we're not going to get very far past that if the people who are sitting down to talk don't want to sit down and talk, and don't want to, in that dialogue, reach some understanding. So that's the first thing. I look for people who actually want to talk. Truth and reconciliation commissions are one way of looking at this. And generally speaking, they have been sponsored by the state. And they have been sponsored by the state because a significant number of people who were involved in the issues thought, we must discuss this. And so there's a convening body that has some authority, but there's also a set of people who are willing to be there and willing to talk. So if you look back over the early 70s in Uganda is usually cited as the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although it didn't use that name. I think the first time that name was used, probably in Chile, actually around 1990. But there have been, literally a couple of hundred probably over time. But they feature somebody who can call you together and people who want to be there when they're called together. So that's the first step. The second step would be to frame the discussion in a way that doesn't involve blame, guilt, and doesn't involve any sort of seeking to disadvantage one party or the other. Most effective dialogues are framed around the notion of understanding. And so if I can invite you in and set the framework and set a structure so that I say why we're here is not to simply talk at one another. What we're here to do is to find out, what are we talking about? What are the definitions we need to use? What are the things that are out there that we need to understand? And can we listen to one another and hear the other party's discussion about those issues? That's the framework that we want to have. And so as the convening factor, I can help enforce that. The other thing that I would start with in any difficult conversation that I was going to try to work with is I would try to invite people into that in a way that doesn't accentuate their differences. I have an acquaintance who did Truth Commission work in Ireland, and there were two sets of dialogues that were attempted. One set invited people in as members of the various factions that were in Ireland, in Northern Ireland particularly, and it was very difficult. The same kind of dialogue was attempted, but the invitation was for people who had suffered from violence, not one side or the other, just people who had suffered from violence. So even though you had people from the same groups who were there, They were invited not as a member of that group, but as someone who had experienced something. So if you could find a way to frame the dialogue, frame the discussion group in a way that creates a group, not two groups coming together, but a group coming together to talk about a particular topic, then you probably have a first step toward finding a way to get them to actually listen to one another. Is that sort of what you were thinking about, Natalia?
Yes, there has to be a starting point. And yes, you are right, because sometimes the do-gooders have this concept that you can force people and make them understand. And you placing the emphasis on the fact that there has to be a will, that someone wishes to listen, but this will can be created on mutual interests, on experiencing mutual of the same circumstances, the same loss, the same feeling of harm or not being understood. And I think that that's a good starting point.
Yeah, and if you're talking about critical race theory and talking about race generally, let's say in the current environment, you have probably the most extreme example of the difficulty in talking about critical race theory is in the school board meetings that are going on now. Those people are coming there they haven't been invited there to discuss and understand. They come there to confront. And so there's a need to remove that confrontational aspect. Pardon me. And one possible way to do that, and I would say as we're talking about this, there are probably dozens of approaches to dialogue and truth and reconciliation, and they all sort of center around the same kinds of things, but they're very, very distinct. And so what we're talking about here is not the end all and be all. But for example, inviting people in and framing the discussion by saying, all of you are interested in quality education for your kids. So that's the frame for our dialogue. And we want to talk about this. And one of the things that's causing us to have questions about the quality of the education is the way we're dealing with issues of race and systemic racism. So we're going to talk about that, but the goal is to figure out how do we get quality education for our kids. Now that sounds like a sort of a simple approach and maybe a naive approach, but if you were successful in doing that, then what you've got are people coming together who have a common interest. They have a shared interest in the outcome. They may not have a shared notion of the truth when they go in. They may not even come out with the notion of the shared truth, because you don't always get agreement when you do dialogue and when you do difficult conversations. But they very well may come out with an understanding of the other side, so that there's a different dynamic when you're done. It's by no means a guarantee that you'll be successful, but this whole notion of getting people together who want to be there and framing it so that they feel like there's a group that they're working with instead of groups that they're working against is the first step in a communication environment that might be successful.
Thank you so much, guys. So let's just take a step back for a minute. First, to remind of our topic, which is dialogue and critical race theory, a conversation on communicating better over racial issues. And also to point out, since this is a audio only broadcast, I'm a Black man, and my two colleagues here, Daniel Rainey and Natalia Laskochaika, are white, right? And Daniel, you're on the East Coast?
Yes.
Of the US, and Natalia is out in Europe, in Poland specifically. And so I'm just bringing that up because we three are having a very good, friendly conversation, not a debate, because we're trying to get to the truth. Okay, we're trying to address what is the closest thing to the truth in terms of how to best approach resolutions to these problems. Because the question is there a problem? Are there problems? Yes, we see them all the time. Like Daniel said, you go to the TV and the evening news, and you have people screaming at each other over what their children are or are not being taught in school. So there's a problem. And then, of course, if you go back a few years, you had right after George Floyd and before, when you had other, controversial police shootings, you had riots in American cities. Okay. And you've had a lot of grievance and injury and a lot of negative conduct and a lot of reaction, positive reaction because of injustice that was being done. And so there's a problem. Everyone knows there's a problem, but addressing the issue, addressing the problem is then the dilemma. And like Daniel, like you said, the way at these school board meetings, the way they've been handling it is they present a forum where people go to express their frustrations. But what you discover is that people go to vent on things that they perceive are happening or perceive are not happening enough. And it becomes a fight where accusations fly, where people are attacked, sometimes personally, character-wise. And after those kind of conversations happen, and the news media picks it up, and then right versus left and the echo chambers pick it up, and then everyone then posts about it on Facebook, and then they stand their ground, and you have this recycling of grievance, okay, where injury produces more injury and negativity produces more negativity. This doesn't help anybody. It doesn't end the toxicity, and it doesn't address the problem that we know exists. And so what we're doing today is we're trying to describe, what's a better way to approach this? And I like what you said, Daniel. You have to invite people to come together. You have to then frame the conversation in a way that does not extend blame, but helps people understand. And you can't accentuate people's differences, because all that's going to do is force them into their corners, into their tribes, and promote the reaction of us versus them, when we all have a common problem. We all agree kids need to be educated, and we all agree that children need to know the truth, okay, about what's happened. I don't think any parent wants their kid to be lied to, but then we disagree about, okay, well, what happened? What is the truth? And we let me read you this little part from the newspaper. This is from the centersquare.com. It's out in North Farmington in Michigan. And in that city, they had a recent critical race theory school board meeting, and it went down the usual thing, right? It was BLM this, BLM that, white person this, white person that, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and exclusion debates. And at the end of the article, there's a mom who's being interviewed, and she says, "We need to give racism the death it truly deserves and stop critical race theory and teach our kids the right values and the right history, and that we do live in the greatest country in the world," McFarland told us Center Square in an interview. However, McFarland says there is a middle line between teaching historical mistakes and teaching critical race theory. "Real history is flawed, sure," McFarland said, "but we were not founded on slavery. We were founded on the Declaration of Independence." So right there, it kind of frames for us the two sides of a debate. And the question is, do we really believe either position is ever going to see that the other side is correct, that we're ever going to make any kind of inroads to resolve and address the problem? And so this is why we're having this conversation, so that we can discuss, what other ways, what better ways exist for us to address a conflict, a dispute that pits people, neighbor against neighbor, and how can then we fix that conflict, fix that dispute. So that's my 2 cents. Just wanted to add all that in there. But could either of you expound a little bit to some of the points that were raised?
Natalia, go ahead.
I truly believe that me being a part of this conversation, I'm bringing a different perspective because I'm not stemming from America and having a different view on that, not being a part of the dispute over the school board meetings, but seeing it from absolutely from the outside and hearing about BLM and what happened, we can see how much emotions driven and knowledge driven certain disputes are. And also how easily it comes to the point when the discussion or whatever the conversation might be, whenever it turns into these issues, gets really heated. And from the technical point of view, I wanted to approach you, Dan, again, how to do that so that people respect themselves in a conversational dialogue they are having, and how to make this process of understanding possible. My reflection on it was that there is like a pre-step to understanding. The pre-step to understanding is being heard, having the space where people can express what was hurtful to them or what they think, and not being immediately criticized, laughed at, disrespected for what they've just said. How do we do that? How do we, being the third party neutrals, like we sometimes are as mediators, ensure those basic rules for starting the process of understanding are fulfilled, are preserved?
Well, you ask such easy questions. If we're correct when we say that our notions of racism and our notions of even our places, what Americans are social constructs, what does that actually mean in practical terms for trying to create dialogue? It is the case in every culture, really. There's not just one society. So if we say that it's a social construct, which part of society is constructing that? Mac used the term echo chamber. I think that's probably a pretty good term. If I'm a white parent and I'm listening to the people who are totally opposed to critical race theory, totally opposed to the notion that there's systemic racism, I'm getting my information from them. That's a socially constructed reality, but it's not the entire society. It's the piece of society that I happen to be listening to. If I'm on the other side and I'm listening to people who think confronting our past is a good thing, then I'm going to have a certain set of attitudes about that, and those are going to create the filters that I'm using. So when I hear you say, as a teacher or as someone who's involved in the public debate, well, this country was founded on slavery, and this country existed on slavery. This country has a lot to answer for in terms of its racial past. I'm not just hearing those words. I'm hearing you attack me as an individual. I'm hearing you attack my country, my group, and me as an individual, because what you're basically saying is that you as a white person, what I'm hearing you say, not what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is that I as a white person ought to be ashamed of my past. And it's very difficult, and it goes the other way as well. If I say that you're tearing the country down, then I'm getting the same reaction on the other side. So, practically speaking, how do you deal with that? Well, you have to first of all acknowledge the fact that we exist in the same country, but in somewhat different societies currently. There's a lot of speculation about the creation of the internet and social media and whatnot, exacerbating and accelerating this. And I think those are true. But regardless, what we've created is a situation where people listen to people who think of the same way they do. And that reinforces the filters that we have that cause us to say what we say and hear what we hear. And I just go back to what you were talking about earlier, Natalia, and that is, I want you to hear me. I don't want you just to hear me and then interpret it the way you want to interpret it based on your filters. I want you to hear it the way I want you to hear it. I want you to hear it the way I mean it. And so the only way that I know to do that as a third party is I go back to what I said before. You have to invite people into that discussion who actually wish to do that. And then I have to frame it and control the conversation so that when we start getting off track, when we start getting into blame and we start getting into the confrontational discussions that you would normally have in the school board meetings we've been talking about, that I have some framework that allows me to say, wait, hold on a second, that's not what we said we were going to do. Let's come back to where we said we were going to be. Let's talk about understanding. Let's talk about at least figuring out why each of us think what we think. And then hopefully that'll let us have some place that we can go with that we might be able to create some common ground. But, there's a sort of a Pollyanna-ish look at dialogue that says, oh, if we can just get dialogue started, we'll be able to fix the problem. Well, I'm more of a pessimist than that. I'm not sure that's true. I think it is true that if we can have a good, honest dialogue, we can know exactly why we disagree. And that may lead us to be able to talk about what we do about it. But it may also simply mean that we know very well why we disagree with one another. And I actually think that's a positive. As opposed to yelling and screaming at each other over things that we don't understand, at least we'd be talking about things that we do understand and know the differences between us. So it's a very difficult question to ask. It's a very difficult position to be in as a third party, because you as a third party don't have the power to do any of this. There has to be some reason that people want to come to you and say, okay, we put ourselves in your system here. We put ourselves in the space where you are, and we're going to let you control that space, and we're going to let you lead us into a discussion that is hopefully going to have understanding and have people being heard. It all starts with people being willing to do that. And right now, I think there are a lot of people who are not willing to do that.
So wanted to add in, as far as dialogue goes, one of the benefits from it is that it creates empathy. Okay. The more people talk, the more they listen to each other, the more they hear each other, the more conversations they have, the more likely it is that they will be able to understand why a person has a position and why a person believes what they believe. It will not necessarily resolve, the conflict, but when the talking stops, a lot of times the bullets start flying in warfare, for example. Okay, we see this, play out, across history. And so there's always a place for dialoguing if it can help create empathy, because eventually when people are able to see things from the other person's point of view and walk in the other person's shoe mentally, okay, after having spent enough time with them, then they have, a place where they can start having some reconciliation. Again, reconciliation may never happen, but I'm just hopeful that talking continues on these subjects. So we're going to be widening it down, guys, because we're going to be going low on time. But one thing I just wanted to add is this: Natalia, Dan, myself, we're all mediators, right? So what we do partly for a living is to help people come together and try to resolve their differences. And so one reason this topic was important to all three of us is because in many ways, we don't just see disputes as just being between two individuals or two families, or, or conflict as just being between a individual in a business or a landlord and a tenant. But dispute and conflict also, grows like a cancer and can permeate an entire society, especially a society that's comprised of various quote unquote racial groups. Okay, I say quote unquote because I have my own opinions about whether or not that even exists, but it's a social construct human construct. And when we have a country like America, and we know the numbers, right? We have X percentage of, white and X percentage African American, AKA Black, a specific percentage of, Latino or Asian this and Asian that. If we don't have conversation, that just having that mix could be a recipe for balkanization and, strife and conflict. So I'm optimistic that what we need to do is just keep on talking and keep communicating in ways that don't accentuate or exacerbate our differences, but actually focus on what we do have in common. And that way it can start building bridges, building more empathy, and seeing, less, conflict overall. But you're only going to get someone to come to your other side, to your side, and help make peace with you, if you're able to have them, hear you and listen from an empathetic heart. Anyway, you guys have closing remarks, and then we can start wrapping it up.
Well, I would just say that I appreciate your optimism. I'm not sure I completely share it, but I appreciate your optimism. And one of the things I would just note is that just having people talk without having some framework that moves them in a positive direction is not in and of itself positive. If I bring you into a room and confront you with other people who don't believe the same thing you believe, and the process that you go through is to have each side defend the position which brought them to the room in the first place, it's very likely that what that does is not change minds. It's very likely that it solidifies the positions they started with. So I would just go back to this notion of if you want to make a difference, then you have to, as a third party, you have to frame that conversation, and you have to create that space which everybody acknowledges is leading you toward understanding as opposed to leading you toward confrontation. It's possible to do that, but it's very difficult these days.
And my perspective on that will be that I see like little steps that can move this entire thing into the right direction. The first step would be hearing about it. So being in an environment and having enough openness to hear that. Then trying to understand, then seeing the truth and going through that, getting into some sort of reconciliation. I wanted to reaffirm this concept that everybody has the right to have a platform, a place where they can express how they were hurt, who hurt them, and being heard about it. And that brings certain relief already. So I do believe and encourage everybody to look around and see that there is a need for us to be open and to listen to people's stories, to be there for them if they need to talk.
All right. And with that, we're going to end this episode, and then we will come back with Dan for another talk another time. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.